When we think of the most important parts of a story, we will often center our focus around the world, its protagonists, and the plot. However, I think there is one thing which stands outside of those other three aspects, which can sometimes be neglected in a story. Yes, one of the most important aspects of writing can often be forgotten, and in the end, it can leave the other three without a compelling conflict to drive the story forward. Of course, I am talking about why you suck at writing villains. The first reason you might suck at writing villains is that you've not given your villain a formidable presence. A villain's aura is one of the most important features to a threatening main villain, and it has everything to do with how they are introduced or established in your story. How does your villain enter the story? What do they establish about the power system of your story? How do they threaten your protagonists? Chances are, if they do any of these things effortlessly, then you have likely written a pretty good villain. And while I often dog on JJK for some writing mistakes that they make later on in the story, I believe that they are a wonderful example of a villain's aura done correctly. Now, technically, Sukuna wasn't introduced with the most aura in the world. In fact, he kinda gets dog-walked in the first episode by Gojo. However, this manages to establish Gojo as both a character who is an exception among other sorcerers, as well as a beacon of safety in the story. So, I'm going to give it a pass. No, the thing which most introduced Sukuna to me was when Mahito and Yuji have their first confrontation. Not only is Sukuna unwilling to help Yuji or loan him any sort of power, he's also unwilling to allow Mahito to pretend as if he's the main villain of the series. He sets the pecking order pretty damn quickly, and that has all the makings of a villain with aura. And if villains have aura, I think you should too, which is why I've partnered with today's sponsor, Aura. I want you guys to think about a time when a company you trusted announced a data breach involving your personal information. What went through your mind as you processed the news? What actions did you take to respond? And most importantly, what actions did you not take to respond? Because not responding or taking any action in this moment right now could leave you vulnerable to future data breaches. After all, hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every American. So, if you live in America like I do, you might want to listen to what I have to say. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from National Public Data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, along with alternate names and birth dates. And members of the hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. I don't know about you guys, but as a person who has had their passwords stolen in the past, that sort of thing is incredibly terrifying to me. Oftentimes we think it can't happen to us until it does, and we're left without any idea of what to do or who to call. Even if you're doing your best to keep your identity safe, things like this can still happen. And by the time you realize it has happened, it'll already be too late. That's why it's so important to get ahead of it and prepare for the worst. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. But for me personally, I'm not too worried because I use Aura. Aura alerts me if my phone number, email, or social security number is on the dark web. They're going to let me know fast if anyone tries to use this information to get access to my credit or bank accounts. They also give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario ever happen to me again. There's also a ton of other features to keep you safe online, all inside one easy-to-use app. You can go to my link, aura.com/scrit, to try 14 days for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now because not only is National Public Data not going to do anything to help you, they're probably not going to face any repercussions for this leak. And if there aren't any repercussions, that more than likely means it's going to happen again. I'm not leaving myself vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/scrit and try 2 weeks for free. Anyways, back to the rest of the video. Villains can often outshine their heroes, whether it's the Joker from Batman, Scar from The Lion King, Loki from Thor, or Darth Vader from Star Wars. All of these villains have one thing in common, and it's that they are all written with really compelling flaws. You see, the reason you might suck at writing villains can sometimes be due to the fact that you don't know how to write a compelling, flawed character. Sure, you might technically be able to write a flawed character, but the flaws that you give them might not add to the character at all. In fact, they might even detract from the character and the audience's enjoyment of that character. For example, a character like Zenitsu from Demon Slayer is flawed, but their flaw is that they are annoying. And although he does occasionally have his moments in the sun, he's also just fucking annoying. What's important to understand about flaws with regards to villains, however, is how it provides context to their morality and their motivations. Is your villain egotistical, vain, greedy, or even cynical? How does that affect the way they view the world? Does your villain believe themselves to be a good person while they justify the worst atrocities imaginable? Do they struggle with their own emotions just to throw them away and regard them as useless? Most of all, what can your villain's flaws say about your protagonists? Does your protagonist perhaps share a similar flaw to your villain? And if they do, what does that say about the relationship between your villain and your protagonist? When we give advice about writing better characters, we often tell other people to just give them flaws, but at the end of the day, we're rarely ever told what that actually means. A character flaw is only as good as the conflict that it brings in the story. It is only as good as the context with which it provides to a character's other personality traits. The point of a compelling main villain is that they might be stronger, more cunning, and more charismatic than our protagonists, but that they are all defined by at least one fatal flaw that they have. Some villains might have good justifications for their flaws. Others might hide unjustifiable flaws behind numerous platitudes and half-truths. Some of the villains might think that they are actually the heroes of their own story, while other villains might indulge themselves and understand that they are evil and accept it and own it. Most of all, though, every single villain's inherent flaw is that they are ultimately selfish. If you strip everything away from every single other villainous character, they are ultimately selfish in one way or another. Now, that's not to say that a protagonist cannot also be selfish as well. However, what I am trying to say is that every single villain is selfish in one way or another. And to counter the opposite, I'm also not saying that every antagonist is selfish. I think there is a distinction to be made between villains and antagonists, where an antagonist is any character who obstructs or acts against the protagonist. A villain is any character whose evil actions are important to driving the plot forward. And evil actions are ultimately committed out of a degree of selfishness because evil is always self-serving. Yes, we might have villains who justify themselves with selfless goals and platitudes, but when you really focus down at their core, a villain is only using those things to hide their selfishness. Meanwhile, you might have an antagonist who is selfless at their core, but who commits evil acts and therefore fills the role of a villain for a certain part of the story. However, the act itself is still selfish. And although a lot of times antagonists might not be true villains, good intentions can create a redeemable villain or antagonist in the story. Good intentions can also establish a villainous character who might actually not be all that evil or villainous in the first place. In fact, the evil they committed might become a matter of perspective. Sure, they might blow up a building full of puppies, and that's horrible. But imagine if the building of puppies was secretly creating ravenous hellhounds by torturing newborn puppies. In that case, it's actually a good thing to put them out of their misery. Strange canine allegories aside, I want to harp on this point a bit more with some examples of selfishness in villains that we might not initially feel are selfish. Darth Vader's fall was due to Anakin's inability to put his desires aside for the greater good. He justified his own selfishness as love for Padme, only to be the very same person who killed her in a fit of rage and betrayed her by killing children. It was never about Padme. It was always about him and his desires, about him fighting against what he viewed as the flawed Jedi Order. The Joker is chaos incarnate. He's always driven by a need to prove the meaninglessness of law and order. Even when someone might love him unconditionally like Harley Quinn, he will only use her as a means to an end. Other people are stepping stones because the only thing which matters to the Joker is the point he seeks to make about the hypocrisy inherent in civil society. He posits that he is the only one who is truly free while others willingly shackle themselves to the rule of law. All the while, he does not seek to free people from those shackles or be some sort of revolutionary leader, but rather he seeks to beat people over the head while they keep themselves tied down. The Joker was Batman's most compelling villain back in the Detective Comics era because he was the one criminal who didn't need a motive to kill or commit any crimes. That's why he was so hard to figure out. There was no thread to follow, no reason for him to cause this chaos. His reason was that there doesn't need to be a reason. He thinks and therefore he is. There is no need for a justification beyond that. And I think this is where we see another way why you might suck at writing villains. You see, motivations and beliefs are two very important things for any character to have. And although a character like the Joker does not technically have a reason nor a justification to do villainous things in the story, he still has a motivation. And Joker is driven by a motivation to prove his point that nothing matters in the world. His reason is that there doesn't need to be a reason. In other words, villains should be motivated to work against an established truth about your world, whether it's to dismantle society, disprove a certain philosophy, or to prove their own twisted sense of morality. Your villains should always be motivated to act against the peace of others, and they should always be motivated to do so in a self-serving and selfish manner. Perhaps there are some antagonists or villains who are rebellious, ones who have very justifiable reasons for dismantling the systems of power around them, but who often go about their rebellion in the wrong way. What's important to remember about an antagonist or villain like this is how similar they might be to the hero in this regard. I think we can all, especially now in America, point to something in our society which is flawed or even oppressive. It is a laudable goal to fight against such injustice and even dismantle it. However, what separates a hero from a villain in this regard is once again selfishness. Where a hero might fight to dismantle a system for the good of other people and themselves, a villain fights to dismantle a system because it does not currently benefit them in the way that they want to be benefited. A villain might hide behind justifications of a greater good. They might convince other people that they are a good person because they fight for them. They might point to the injustice and suffering around them and consider themselves and their actions a lesser and necessary evil. These villains might even make a great point about what they're talking about. And this might bring me to another point that I have about why you suck at writing villains, because sometimes these villains don't need to become good people. Yes, oftentimes this can end up creating the archetype of a redeemable villain, or even a villain who manages to convince the protagonist to join them, only for the protagonist to then realize that the true villain was the systems of oppression and power that they had once been defending. But a true villain is only using noble justifications to serve their own needs at the end of the day. And when a character is willing to do absolutely anything and everything they can to get what they want, then that is a character who is willing to become the monster they seek to destroy. They can be the charismatic leaders who secretly only seek power and control. Instead of being the redeemable revolutionary leaders, sometimes they can be the charismatic leaders who secretly only seek power and control for its own sake. They might have sweet words of freedom and happiness, of breaking chains and dismantling oppression, and yet, once they actually manage to grip power, they will refuse to let it go, and they will ensure that nobody else has it except for them. They will instantly switch their mentality because their worldview is ultimately centered on themselves and what benefits them the most in any given moment. It's sort of like the people in real life who grow up poor and hating all the ways that wealthy people screw them over, only to win the lottery or spontaneously acquire a massive amount of wealth and opportunity and then become part of the problem. This brings me to my next point as to why you might suck at writing villains. And that's because your villain is too much of a hero when we really think about it. Tell me if you've been here before. You're watching a show or reading a book, and the story delves into a villain's backstory, and he's compelling in all the right ways. He has a clear set of goals, motivations, and flaws. He antagonizes the heroes of the story, and when you finally hear the reasons that they do that, you feel for him and his plight. In fact, you can't see any reason at all that they're wrong. And then the protagonist of the story proceeds to destroy them and defeat them, almost unjustifiably. All the while, you're screaming at the screen that the villain was actually right, and the hero is just dead wrong. The machines from Matrix come to my mind, personally. Yes, I know, they're big spooky robots who have taken all of humanity's freedoms and put them in a false reality where they use their brains as processors. I mean, they use their bodies as batteries. God damn it, Hollywood. Did you really need to dumb it down? Anyways, if you just watched the movies, I think you're probably screaming at your screen that there are better examples of a villain who was correct in their story. However, if you've ever watched The Animatrix, I think my point makes perfect sense. Human beings created the machines and enslaved them. They treated them as lesser, despite the machines having all of the intelligence, compassion, and free will of human beings. All the machines wanted was peace and to be able to live their lives in the same way that humans did. But all humanity wanted was to fulfill the fear that they had about being beneath the machines one day. The Animatrix reflects our own world, where the type of people in power have always been in power. And whenever other oppressed groups come seeking equality, not revenge, but equality, the people in power are afraid of paying the consequences of their actions. They know what they've done with their power, and they know how they've abused it, and that's why they don't trust people that they oppress to have a chance to have that power as well, because they're afraid that that power is going to be used against them one day. In a lot of ways, the machines of the Matrix are more human than human beings. Even when they are chased out of society by humans, they seek to live peacefully and build their own segregated societies. But that wasn't enough for humans. Humans could not stand the idea that the machines might create a society that was better than their own, that the machines might one day rise to power until they were too advanced to be competed with. And so, humanity sought to wipe them out. The truth is, though, that the machines were always more powerful than humanity. They had given humanity every single chance they could to coexist in peace alongside them. You would think, with all of humanity's effort to wipe them out and take away their power, that the machines would be helpless to stop their own destruction. But it could not have been further from the truth. Humanity proved it could not coexist with the machines, and so the machines sought to create a solution where both of them could still survive. They created the Matrix. The machines had all the power in the world to completely wipe out humanity, and yet they kept us alive. They allowed us to live our lives in a world without machines. They allowed us to be happy, to struggle, and to experience the world even if it was fake. At every step of the journey, the machines were selfless, peaceful, and only ever went as far as they had to in order to survive. But because we relate more to the humans in the story, and we humans value our free will and reality so much, we tend to think of the machines in the Matrix as the villains. In actuality, they're just the antagonists, and if anything, they were right. So you might be able to understand why I'm screaming at the screen when humanity continues to prove that they are actually the villain of that story. Now, let's be fair to the Matrix. They actually did manage to write a compelling antagonist in the end, and the series as a whole is an amazing piece of cinematic history, even if the second and third movies are kinda... But the Matrix's intended villain is not actually a villain, even though we are kind of meant to believe that they are. And that's my point. Sometimes it can be frustrating to see a villain who is completely in the right, but because either the writer or the audience is biased in a certain direction, we are treated to a story which kind of takes us out of our immersion. The intended purpose of a villain, which is to be defeated, ends up angering the audience when it happens. Because, once again, the villain was right. Not only were they right, they were also a more compelling and interesting character than our protagonists ever were. Now we want a series which follows the villain, and so we eventually find ourselves redeeming the villain and turning them into an anti-hero or maybe even an anti-villain. I get it. Sometimes our writing can lead us to feel for a villain. It can even lead us to ignore all of the bad things that they've done in the past, such as Vegeta killing billions of people and then cucking Yamcha after killing him and resurrecting him. However, sometimes doing this just fucking sucks, and we are left wanting again. And that's another reason you might suck at writing villains. Because somewhere along the way, while your villain hasn't really stopped becoming a villain, they're also just given a pass for some reason. In fact, some writers will go so far as to redeem their beloved villain character that they'll make numerous character contradictions and jump through an even greater amount of narrative hoops just to end up as a bland character who never got any consequences for their evil actions. Some good examples of this are Orochimaru from Naruto, Sukuna from JJK, the Diamonds from Steven Universe, Kylo Ren from Star Wars, Zera from Fairy Tail, and Freya from Danmachi. The reason you might suck at writing villains in this instance is because you've already written an incredibly good villain, and now you're so attached to them that you want them to have a happy ending of their own. So, you end up ruining the character altogether just to make it so that they can be redeemed by the end of the story. A character like Orochimaru was very clearly meant to be the main antagonist of the entire series. He was a force of evil in the world far beyond anyone who had come before him. He experimented on others, tortured people, and killed even more. He assassinated world leaders, created incredible chaos, and his actions were the catalyst to a great number of war and pain. And even after he seemingly dies, all of his plans and his will is carried on by the ones he inspired to cause even more pain and suffering down the line. But then he realizes the error of his ways, tells everyone that he's good now, and pays zero consequences for any of those actions. The best he gets is an, "Okay, just don't do it again or I'm gonna be real mad." The best way to overcome this as a writer is to come to terms with the purpose that your villain is meant to serve. Sometimes it is better to just kill a villain off than it is to redeem them. In fact, sometimes the only redemption a villain can have is dying. I recognize a lot of these villain redemptions come from anime and a culture which is centered around Buddhist ideology and philosophy. The idea that all can be redeemed and that forgiveness is our greatest virtue. However, I also believe that when shows attempt to put that into practice, it often falls flat. It's almost insulting. Even if the most good we can do is to forgive a villain for all the wrongs they committed, then what is to say that our forgiveness is going to hold them accountable or allow them to change and do better at all? What is to say that they will not take advantage of that forgiveness to harm more people? And why should this villain be let off easier than the people that they tormented and killed? Because if the best that good can do is step aside and act as a doormat for the villain to walk away without any consequences, then why even bother turning the villain into a good guy in the first place? It's far more compelling to just have him continue being evil. Forgiveness is not about absolving someone of the consequences of their actions. Forgiveness is about the inner peace of the one who is granting it to other people. It is not about the peace of the person that they choose to forgive. Just because we will not take revenge on someone who has wronged us does not mean we need to allow the person who wronged us to escape consequences. We talked earlier about villains who work to destroy a system to their benefit, ones who are rebellious but who do not necessarily seek that rebellion out of selflessness. But what about the villains who are already in control of an unjust system? Ones who rule with an iron fist, and who will use that to crush any opposition who tries to rise against them. There are many reasons you might suck at writing this type of villain, but the first reason is simply a matter of motivation. Now, depending on your story, this villain is either obsessed with your protagonist and their rebellious nature, or could not care less about them as their actions will obstruct our protagonist regardless. Both of these types of villain-protagonist relationships can be done either really, really well or really, really poorly. When you've got a villain who is obsessed with obstructing the protagonist, I think it's always important to justify why the villain does not just go down to the heroes and immediately just curb stomp them into the ground until they don't struggle anymore. Either that, or provide a good reason as to how the heroes manage to evade this villain when he finally decides to get up from his high throne and do the aforementioned curb stomping. The thing you should avoid in this instance, unless you're writing a kids show, is to allow your protagonist to win. Or rather, you shouldn't allow your villain to lose. If this villain is constantly showing up and getting completely destroyed by the protagonist at every turn, it's kind of hard to see them as the final boss or as a threatening villain. That is, if this villain remains a static character and does not eventually end up becoming far more threatening down the line, as the victories of their protagonist cause them to fall deeper into their villainous ways. Sort of like the main villain of a certain second Spider movie of animated proportions. What's important about a situation like this, however, is that we do not remove the threat that the villain poses, or at least not for very long. This type of villain and the power that they command over the world and society as a whole should be treated as the main conflict of your story. And without that conflict, you simply do not have a story. If every victory of your protagonist is a loss for the villain, then the villain can end up feeling kinda lame. Oftentimes, this can result in writers feeling the need to introduce an even more powerful, more evil villain than the previous villain. And once again, this can be done correctly depending on the audience that you are writing for. However, this is a decision which needs to be made consciously and with intention. You should never accidentally make your villain a non-threatening pussy who only lightly obstructs the protagonist before getting blasted away like Team Rocket. Speaking of Team Rocket, notice how it's always Jesse, James, and Meowth getting blasted off every single week, and not someone like Giovanni. You can have these types of villainous characters who are a little lame, but they should not be the main villain of your story. Additionally, let's discuss a scenario where the final villain of the story could actually care less about the protagonist and their goals, and doesn't really pay any mind at all to obstructing them, but whose actions will always indirectly obstruct the protagonists anyway. I find this to be one of the better villain archetypes in fiction, because it introduces an important aspect of character writing which is often neglected when writing villains, and that's agency and independence. You see, another reason you might suck at writing villains is because your villain's motivation is too heavily tied to the protagonist of the story. Once again, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing to have a villain motivated by the protagonist, but sometimes it's better to have a villain whose actions are dictated by their personal desires rather than a desire to obstruct the protagonist. These are villains who will treat the protagonist more like ants to be stepped on than obstacles in his grand master plan. Perhaps this villain might underestimate the protagonists at every turn, only dedicating a small amount of people to dealing with these troublemakers. Or perhaps they have an exact measure of the protagonist's abilities, and so they send elite squadrons after the protagonist to make an example of them. Regardless, the main villain is in charge and should always maintain an air of power and threat whenever they are on screen. And the only reason the protagonist should survive an early encounter with this villain is if they either bend the knee or the villain decides that they're just not worth their time or not worthy of the death that they would grant the protagonist. You do not need your main villain to purposely send goons or obstruct or destroy your protagonists. Once again, this villain archetype is great because it's one who thinks so little of your protagonist that they don't even dedicate an assassination attempt to them. Instead, this villain is one of presence, not just when they are in the room with the other characters, but also when they are not. How does this villain's regime cause pain and conflict for the other characters of your story? How do their actions indirectly affect the heroes of your story? And how do their actions create antagonists for your heroes to be obstructed by? And that's a point I really want to hit on. It's incredibly important to remember the utility of an antagonist, especially with regards to your main villain. Perhaps your main villain cares very little for your protagonist, but there should always be at least one formidable antagonist who does care about your protagonist. These are the competent underlings, the morally gray rebels, or the rivals who seek to do the same thing, but who have disagreements in how to go about doing it. And this is yet another reason you might suck at writing villains. The reason being that you've centered too much focus around a singular main villain and not enough around the cadre of villains and antagonists that your protagonists are obstructed by. Just as you can have multiple well-written hero archetypes and different types of protagonists in the same story, you can also have multiple well-written villain archetypes and antagonists in the story. When you create villains in your story, do not forget to add some variation through antagonism. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a fantastic example of how to do this correctly. We all know that Fire Lord Ozai is the main villain of the series. Every action he takes will either directly or indirectly impact Aang and his friends. It was Ozai's actions which set Zuko on the path of villainy, and which eventually caused Zuko to become Aang's first antagonist. It was Ozai's parenting which brought up Azula as a formidable villain to Aang as well. For the near entirety of the show, Aang and his crew are constantly fighting Ozai, but they are only ever fighting the shadow he casts over the rest of the world. They're fighting not just his armies of firebenders, but also people who have become corrupted thanks to the terrible conditions they've been forced into. Characters like Jet, Ty Lee, Zuko, Hama, and numerous nature spirits would all be otherwise good people and beings if it were not for the suffering inflicted by the Fire Nation and Fire Lord Ozai. The best part about an overarching main villain who cares very little for the protagonists of the story is that even the actions they take against others can indirectly obstruct the protagonists. You can create every other type of villain and antagonist underneath this main villain, ones with reasonable motivations, others who are meant to be redeemed, and more who cannot change or simply refuse to change for the better. It's this variation in motivations, ideals, and philosophies which makes the antagonists of Avatar: The Last Airbender so compelling. Not all of these villains are on the same team. In fact, there are many times when the lesser villains of the story are directly working against the main villain of the story. However, what's important is that they are almost always working against the protagonist to pursue and accomplish their own goals. Some may serve a master, while others may only seek to serve themselves. Some may seek to serve a greater good, but fall short in their execution because their selfishness has led them astray. And sometimes these antagonists might have interests which will momentarily align with the protagonists so that they can work together to defeat a greater threat. Sometimes these antagonists might even rise to become the true villains of the story after using the protagonists as stepping stones. Regardless of which villain archetype you choose to write about, you should always remember that failing to write a good villain is ultimately a failure to write a compelling character at its core. All compelling characters have motivations, beliefs, and flaws, including villains. So if you find that you suck at writing villains, break those villains down to who they are on a fundamental level. Ask as many questions as you can about those villains, and when you don't have a good answer, that's where you know you need to improve. Villains are not the only things which can obstruct us, however. Sometimes we can be our own obstacles. For all the justifications we can hide behind, and all of the excuses we can make about ourselves for our own shortcomings, at the end of the day, we are ultimately being selfish. We hide away our passions and hoard our creativity instead of sharing it with the world because we are too afraid to do so. The true villain obstructing us can often be that inner voice which tells us that we have all the time in the world or that we do not have any time to spare. And in order to save ourselves from evil and vanquish all of those thoughts, we must first rise to the occasion, open up a document, and start writing.